Today on The Occult Detective, we're going to take a look back in time to what life was like before the Satanic Panic. I don't think young people realize just how crazy the 1970s were. It was an occult explosion, led primarily by two movies, Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. It sparked an interest in the occult, something that had already begun in the 60s, I suppose. The whole Aquarian age, kind of hippie wave, where people were rediscovering Tolkien, people were rediscovering Crowley, and people like Timothy Leary were kind of delving into that blend of fantasy and mysticism and hallucinogens. But that did bring about, I suppose, another event that was a real catalyst, was the Manson murders, so-called Manson murders, I should say. But kind of the point being that I was born in 1966. So just as this explosion was in full force, I was a very young person, but I saw all of this everywhere. It just permeated everything. For me, a child, from a very, very young age, who was kind of raised on not only, folk tales and urban legends and ghost stories, but also, Carl Kolchak, that first television movie in '72, and then, all that just kind of steamrolled. And, there were witches on television all the time, paranormal investigators, people like Hans Holzer you saw on these programs, Sybil Leek, Alex Sanders, Gerald Garner, it was everywhere, and it really permeated the culture. And this was, in a large part, I guess what led into, because just became so ingrained in society. There was the obvious backlash, which was the Satanic Panic of the 80s, that roped in, rock and roll, heavy metal in particular, but also like Dungeons and Dragons and all those things that we were so obsessed with for a decade suddenly became the very embodiment of devilry. So it got me thinking about that life before the Satanic Panic, which, the Satanic Panic itself had a huge impact on me. Because, the Satanic Panic hit, in my teen years. So, it was a very heady time, if you will. But as I said, thinking back on, those early days, I've told the story many times about how I discovered the book Unseen Forces by Manly Palmer Hall in amongst my great grandmother's things. And reading that book, I realized that there was something beyond fiction, to this magical world that I was kind of obsessing with already. Where does a person, especially somebody so young, I was like, 8, 9, 10 years old, those eras, right? So where do you go to get, subject matter, in this pre-internet world? Well, the local library, of course, right? And so that's kind of what I mainly wanted to discuss, was how in the early 70s, going to the public library, I lived outside of a town that had about 900 people. It was a small rural farming community. You know, strolling through town, you had you know, a local Ford dealership. That was kind of the big deal, that we had one of those. But we had, you know, small restaurants, coffee shops. We had a Sundries, which was where we got our comic books and our cherry cokes and ice cream. It was like a 1950s diner. And that was the thing about the town I grew up in, or outside of anyway. It was frozen in time in many ways. I think it was probably close to 1990 before that town left the late 50s. And it just steamrolled quickly. But, you know, as a kid, if I watched Happy Days or Laverne and Shirley on TV, it did not seem any different from that town that I maneuvered in, which leads to the point that the small public library we had, at Carnegie Library, um, you walked up those limestone steps and entered this, just beautiful building, very small but beautiful. Carnegie really spared no expense on these things. He kind of littered them all across the Midwest. But in the library, in the adult section of the library, which kids were given free reign to, they had a pretty impressive occult section. So after having read Unseen Forces and hungry for more, I thought, well, I went up to the librarian. I said, do you have any books on, strange phenomenon? Do you have do you have books on like witchcraft and UFOs? And she said, of course, and she led me to this section. Have a look. And here you had, Richard Cavendish. You had, The Occult by Colin Wilson. You had Gerald Gardner's book on witchcraft. You had Patricia Crowther. You had Sybil Leek's Book of Curses. And oddly enough, a work of fiction was there also, which was Black Easter by James Blish. And I read all of those, and there were other books too, like Encyclopedia of the Occult and books like that. And I read through all of them. They had a nice section of flying saucer books. There were books on that didn't use the term, but books on cryptids, stuff like books on Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, that kind of stuff. And yeah, it was really an impressive array, especially considering, it's 1970s small town America, smack dab in the Midwest, the heart of it. And all of that was indicative of the larger culture, and that whole occult revival that was steamrolling since the 60s and then started taking a much darker turn. Because if you looked at the occult films that were coming out, like I mentioned Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, but then you had The Omen and stuff like that, and so there was a real kind of almost taboo feel to the occult at the time. But again, it was everywhere. Even in comic books, you had a whole line of horror comics, of course, brilliant stuff like Tomb of Dracula and Werewolf by Night, Son of Satan, uh, the Living Mummy, and just really great stuff. And in the back of those books, would have ads for like the Frosts, who had like a witchcraft school you could learn from, and just it was all very. It was a fascinating time, and one that I was so blessed to have been born into. But then the backlash, the Satanic Panic that came about largely through people like Sally Jesse Raphael and Geraldo Rivera and Phil Donahue, who just kind of grabbed this kind of swell of anti-occult thinking that came out of fundamental Christianity. And I can attest that I went to numerous book burnings, album burnings. They were attacking everything I loved. Occult books, for one, but also horror novels, science fiction novels. They were, playing records backwards and pointing out just all these. I mean, okay, it's one thing when you're burning like Black Sabbath and your Led Zeppelins and Fleetwood Macs, who have a kind of occult like essence to them, but they were burning, Hall and Oates, and all of it was crazy. One night in particular, a local church was burning albums, books too, but mainly it was record albums. And they had this big bonfire started, and they're outside. They got a preacher out there. It's kind of a revival, and he's going on and on about the evils of rock and roll music. And they've got trucks sitting there just heaping with records, and they're just like shoveling these things in. And me and a couple of my buddies, we start grabbing them. We're just like hugging them, and we're running. We saved as much as we could. I got some good stuff out of that. Some Elton John. Yeah, Elton John, the devil. It was insane. In college, they would put out flyers, and you could go there on the campus, and they would be having lectures about backmasking. And they're playing, Stairway to Heaven backwards. It was insane, and it was obvious to anyone listening that it was not saying what they were saying it was saying. There were some real backmasking, that had been done. The Beatles had done so, ELO, a lot of bands did legitimate backmasking. That was really neat and clever, and, but, the stuff that was obviously just backwards, ridiculous. All of it was ridiculous. And, like I said, they were attacking Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music, and it was a rough time. I don't think people realized just how nutty it was. It's how I grew up, and I really appreciate the 70s for what they were. Yes, they gave us disco, but still, the occult elements of that era were just terrific. And I'm still, in that mindset. I think of, the great Doctor Strange runs there in the mid to late 70s, especially the ones written by Chris Claremont. I thought, were very, in keeping. In fact, insider baseball information, there were, legitimate occultists who were placed inside those issues that Claremont was writing, because at the time he was dating a very prominent witch in the Westchester area, and he had connections to like James Wasserman of the OTO, and he was hanging out at the Magical Child where the Necronomicon was born, and just that whole era of magic. It's still, fascinating to me. And I think in a large part because I was so young then. It was something I wanted to be a part of, but I was too young to be anything but on the fringe of it. And yeah, so nostalgia, it's a wonderful thing. Well, anyway, I've rambled far too much, so. But that's just, I wanted to, just get that out of my head as I was thinking about it. I'm still working my way through Magic at the Crossroads by Kate Fruhler. Really fascinating book. That's probably what kind of sparked some of this in my head, reading it. And so it's one I recommend, and I'll be reviewing soon. I guess I'll leave you at that, and we'll talk again real soon.